All right, welcome, Dave, to Proof Points. This is a segment at New Current where we delve into the core of innovation in the tech industry. And you've wrote a really important book in this industry called the Qualcomm Equation. And I don't want you or the audience to take my word for it. Bill Gurley is a very famous person in the venture community. He's been extremely successful. And he wrote a quote about this book. And he said, Dave Mock helps uncover the single most important business story that has yet to be told: how Qualcomm came to rule the wireless industry. Think of it as a recipe book for one of the most innovative and leveraged business models of all time. So, Dave, that's a big vote of confidence from Bill Gurley, one of the most legendary VCs, and I'm really excited to explore this recipe with you today. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Jacob. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So let's just start at the beginning. In your book, you said Qualcomm didn't invent CDMA, it pioneered it. Can you talk about what that means and what their pioneering journey in CDMA was?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, any invention or any brand new technology obviously has a long evolution. And the book actually goes way back, even back into the early 20s and the discussions about, communications technology and where it bore from. So there's always going to be arguments about who invented something. But honestly, it takes a whole ecosystem of people and an evolution over a lot of times over decades. So the pioneering part is making it real, bringing it into the world that a person like you or me can pick something up and use it. And it's only enabled by that underlying invention or series of inventions that had to happen over decades. So that's the point where, people, I think, tend to realize it's not just some brilliant guy coming up with a great idea, writing a patent, put it on paper. It's all that hard grind year after year, decade after decade of getting it mature enough to where somebody could actually have the income to buy something cheap enough that does this fantastic, wonderful thing in their life and make a big difference in the world.
Yeah. So you mentioned going back into the 20s. The book starts with a fascinating, eye-opening revelation that the undercurrent of CDMA was pioneered by Hedy Lamarr in a very interesting circumstance. Can you cover that a little bit? I mean, that was such a cool story.
Yeah, it's that's everyone loves that story because it's so surprising. It's
Yeah.
kind of unknown and the secrecy around it and how it's evolved. And just when you get down to the story, it's a little bit of Hollywood, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
these two people deep in Hollywood that sit late at night and write on an envelope how they're going to do this cool idea to defeat the Nazis. I mean, it's like a movie itself.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that other people have picked that story up and run with it. There's been several follow-on stories, and I've heard of some movies and documentaries made about Hedy Lamarr because it's a great story. And honestly, probably one of the more disappointing points of the book is I actually had an image of that envelope that they had initially crafted this idea on for using piano rolls to synchronize frequency to
Yeah.
communications, and it didn't make it into the book. But her son still has, as far as I know, has that envelope of this seminal idea. So it's a great way to kind of bring this whole evolution and this whole story. Started off with a bang of how this stuff just comes from unexpected places, and but then the long hard grind of decades of hard work to actually evolve it and make it into something practical. It's neat to go through the different cast of characters through all the generations and tell that story.
Yeah. You're right. It is. I mean, literally, it's straight out of Hollywood. She
Yeah.
was married to a pretty senior Nazi official. She heard what the Nazis were doing, escaped, became a Hollywood star, and also is some master mathematician because she figured out how
Yeah.
to do code hopping to synchronize missile guidance systems. And those patents stayed locked up by the US military for decades, right?
Yeah, for
Really
quite a few
incredible.
years. Yeah.
Yeah. So from
Yeah.
there, you had Irwin Jacobs and Paul Verterbi. That's it. Is that right?
Andrew Viterbi.
Andrew Verterbi. Yeah, it's never wrong.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking Paul Jacobs, the
His son.
CEO that succeeded. Yeah. So they were the trailblazers. They not only had the dreams and the innovation, but as you said, they dared to live it. And they were really disruptors in an industry. And I loved a quote that you brought in. You said disruption is just as much about the soon to be overthrown competition as it is about the company that's violating the existing order. Successful disruptive companies don't blindly push against barriers to entry. They methodically react to events and decisions to attack competing weaknesses that develop over time. That's so cool. That's very powerful. How did Qualcomm disrupt the wireless communication space with CDMA? And how did barriers like regulatory and competitive threats come into play?
Well, it's a big question, and it is a big answer, and that's kind of one of the main lessons I took learning myself in the process of writing this book. They never had a vision right from the beginning. Like, here's what we're going to do. This is what CDMA is going to be. This is how it's going to disrupt this industry. They knew communications technology. So they had to kind of, I don't know if rolling with the punches is a way to express it, but they were the world experts in communication technology, specifically digital communications. And Andrew Viterbi talked about, hey, we were playing with digital communications before anybody was even talking about it.
Yep.
They did not look at themselves as, we're this company, here's how this company is going to be successful. They were looking at it like, we know this technology, we know it has advantages in all these areas, we're just looking for the right opening. And the cellular market came long after a lot of a string of successes they had in satellite communications, in communications with the military. So it wasn't so much of like they mapped it out and they just followed their plan. They had to bob and weave and duck and jive it seemed like every year, every couple of years, as they got hit with a new, well, now the competition's going this way. How would we react? How would we re-strategize our approach here? And they were always the underdog, I think, was all until they've got to the point where they are, obviously, in the last decade or so. So people tended to ignore them. And so they could, change their approach and just, attack the different areas that they needed to and not be wedded to any, they didn't have a huge revenue stream in certain technologies, in certain markets, that when you're a large company, you have to think about protecting that. That's your
Sure.
cash. That keeps the business afloat. They
Yeah.
didn't have to worry about that. They often talked about, we were a group of consultants. Even when Qualcomm founded in the early years, they kind of looked at themselves as just highly knowledgeable consultants. They didn't have to protect a status quo business. So yeah, so that long quote you read there's a lot packed in that, but it does kind of dispel the myth that you know you can start a company with one idea, with one approach, and then expect to keep that same approach and not have to modify it and maybe sometimes completely unravel it and take a different approach depending on the market, how it evolves, the timing. And just, for instance, timing is always something that everybody gets wrong. We always think that technologies will evolve faster than they typically do. As things stretch out in terms of time, you have to evolve your strategy because a lot of times your company runs out of money before you get to that point where your technology is ready to get into the market. So there's a lot of times they had to back up, raise more money, take a contract maybe they didn't want to have to take to keep the company alive. So
Yep.
there's a lot of that in any business. That's how you stay alive.
Yeah. There's a section of the book where it basically turns from being, the evangelization, foundational innovation, pioneering portion of the book to how do we turn this into a dominant business that really makes waves. And during that part, Steve Altman becomes more of a prominent
Yes.
character because he came in to really build this licensing model. It makes me think of a paraphrase I'll do of Bill Gates, who known for saying most people underestimate how long it's going to take and the impact in the short term, and they overestimate that. So they think it's going to happen quicker and it's going to have more impact in the short term, but they underestimate technology in the long term. We were thinking about that a lot right now with AI. People are expecting it
Yep.
to be sentient and take over in like 2 years. That's
Yep.
probably not going to happen. Right now it's
Yeah.
really sophisticated algorithms, but it's not really, there's not some brain out there glowing and figuring everything out. But maybe over 10 years, it's going to be even more
Yeah.
revolutionary than we can even imagine today.
Exactly. There's going to be a lot of surprises, and there's going to be a lot of applications. And I think that's kind of the key thing, particularly with Qualcomm. I mean, at the founding, these guys were PhDs. They knew the theory cold. I mean, they were students of Claude Shannon. They knew
Yep.
information. So they knew the capacity of what digital communications and that, communications theory could do. What they didn't know is kind of like what you said, where AI is today. How do we get the theory actually implemented in applications that technology today can support? And in the case of cellular communications, it was power. What we can make all this work, but the battery's got to be massive. There's no way somebody could walk around with it. So all those practical limitations come in, and those are the key problems that, to me, that's where the interesting pioneering comes in, is tackling each one of those little problems that keep an idea in theory that's fantastic from actually working in the real world.
Tying that together with what you just said about them viewing themselves as consultant and just technical experts, you made it very clear that by force, or more so by force than by will, Qualcomm had to do the dirty work in order to get their licensees on board, because if they didn't, what was going to happen is people would just default to TDMA. It was easier.
Yep.
And so Qualcomm ultimately made it easier by shouldering the development and production work so that their customers could actually implement the technology, take it to market, and see the benefits of it. But they weren't able to just sit back like, I think at that time, licensing businesses were typically like, hey, we invented it. Look at this piece of paper. Now you can pay us for it. And Qualcomm took a very different approach than that, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's been a common response, and I'm sure I've written it a couple times there in the book, that intellectual property is more than just patents. It's more than
Absolutely.
what's written on the paper. And there's some really good quotes I've heard recently about, what you're paying for in that patent is not the idea that's on the piece of paper. It's the 10, 20, 30 years of innovation and hard work that all the people went in to developing that concept.
Absolutely.
But you do raise a key point of then the implementation of that. Um, Evangelizing a technology to your potential customers or to competitors or people who are fighting against it in standard bodies is one thing, but demonstrating that it can actually work uh, was a big hurdle for Qualcomm for a good decade or two in terms of the cellular market.
Yep.
They're they when they kind of graduated that first phase, like, okay, these guys are smart, they know what they're talking about, but can you actually make a phone call work on this technology? Can you, so a lot of the doubting was, chipset technology is nowhere near advanced enough to implement those kind of radios. The computational load is just way too heavy for batteries technology today. So at each turn, you're squashing one argument and getting people, okay, I'll
Yep.
concede that to you, but now there's this new set of problems. And Qualcomm, you're right, they had to tackle each one of those problems, and a lot of times it was in succession. It was, you reach one peak of the mountain and you realize you've got another section to climb. That, like,
Yep.
okay, now that we've tackled this issue, we've got a good solution for it. Three new issues come up, and being able to, keep going and work your way through those, I think, is what's made them successful.
Yeah, the Acquired podcast did a really good podcast
Yeah.
about this, and I like what they said. They said Qualcomm had to thread the eye of the needle about 10 different times. And because they did that, they've created this massively influential, couldn't live without technology. But going into it, you need that level of conviction, you need that expertise, you need to always be on offense. You've talked about that, where
Yep.
they weren't being defensive. They weren't trying to protect a golden goose. They didn't have an innovator's dilemma. They just had a challenge in front of them. And they said, we're going to
Yep.
make this happen because we know it's theoretically possible. But they needed this tailwind of different technologies coming in. You know, TSMC is a very important part of the
Yep.
Qualcomm story because they improved the
Yeah.
fab capability. So they needed all these convergence of technologies to ultimately thread the needle and create this multi-$100 billion company we know today. But it it didn't happen all from a pure vision of straight line thinking, and this is how we're going
Yeah.
to get there. And it took a lot of ingenuity, a lot of expertise, and a lot of hard work.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think what underpins that, Jacob, is you have to have the notion that it's not a matter of if, it's when. It's just all, when is that convergence going to happen? And it was interesting as I was looking back through kind of the timeline of Qualcomm, as we were talking before. we look back on the story, and this all happened in a very short period of time. But this was, spanned well over a decade for them, looking at digital communications and looking at the cellular market. And so, they were evolving this over years and years and years. So I would just imagine them being in a room like, we
Hmm.
know this is going to be in cellular communication someday. We know that this is the best way to do it. We
Hmm.
just don't know when. We just don't know when those other technologies, chipset technology, power technology, battery technology, is going to enable these certain things. And they could see it coming because they were doing satellite communications, the OmniTrack system and things that they were
Yep.
doing with satellite trucking communication. And they had a window into this future. And I think honestly that's what has to keep you going, because it was more than 10 problems. It was more than, I would say it was, dozens or hundreds of things where they probably thought, this is it, this is the deal killer, this is going to make CDMA impossible. There's no way we're going to overcome this. So you had to have, the evangelists in the room saying, no, we know
Yeah.
it's possible. You guys just have to figure out a way to make it happen. And those are some of the best stories I got from talking to various people. That was those binge sessions where they all got in a room and like, look, we have 8 practical problems we have to tackle with, this contract or this, and they would just spend all day just going at it and trying to, throw stuff on the wall and see what works. And but that had to happen repeatedly and constantly and over months and months and weeks and years, in order to be successful. So it's that grind to get all those little problems tackled. I think that's the magic in Qualcomm.
Yeah, they say you can't make diamonds without pressure. And I think
Yep.
all of us have these stories from building companies, especially in high tech spaces, where the technology is inevitable, but the timeline to get there is
Yep.
unclear. The reason it's unclear is because physics gets in the way, engineering gets in the way, uh, of limitations of hardware, limitations of software that need to all be overcome. And it's I admire them so much, and they've earned their position
Yep.
by doing the hard work and keeping their conviction. And I'm sure there were many times when they were looking in the mirror saying, why am I doing this? Why would I
Yeah.
even,
Where's this going?
where's this going? Like, should I be doing something else? Like, I
Yep.
have a PhD from MIT. I can probably do something else than this. And I commend them and I admire them all. In their broader team. The first 50 people, the first
Yeah.
100 people. Those are the people that really make it happen. The founders get the credit as they deserve,
Yeah.
but also, those first people, I'm sure have so much to do with the success of that company.
Yeah. The team that surrounds you is obviously critical. But it's a reflection of the founders. You seek out the people that um, understand the ideas the way you do, and have that same spirit. And yeah, I'm sure the process was ugly too. It's interesting when you look at movies and stories and books and stuff like that. It kind of tends to glamorize it.
Sure.
I've been through some processes like that myself. It's you fight, you yell at each other, you're enemies one day, you're back in it, but you're all connected by this desire to make this work. And as long as you know in your heart that, yeah, this is going to work somehow, I just don't know how, you kind of fight through that. I mean, I had several comments from guys like, yeah, we used to bicker like brothers. We beat each other's throat technically over, what to do. But then the next day we'd be back in the lab and working side by side again, trying to get something to work. So, um,
Yeah.
yeah, getting to the finish line is not as easy as it looks a lot of times when you look at hindsight.
Yeah. It makes me think of another Bill Gurley statement where he says, most startups are failures up until the minute they're not.
Yeah,
And so you're fail, 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 fail. Oh, we hit something,
exactly.
and then now it looks, in retrospect, it looked like the
Yeah,
grand
easy.
plan the grand plan came to fruition. Like, those people are so
Yeah.
smart, but it's a lot more elbow grease usually than people understand, and a lot more heartbreak along the way. So speaking of friendships, enemies, they can change over time. It makes me think of two important parts of the Qualcomm story. One of which is related to litigation and the importance of litigation and some of their pivotal lawsuits, but then also standards development. And I think that they're not the same, but you almost can't separate them because
Yep.
that this is kind of how they work. So how did Qualcomm approach developing standards and leveraging litigation to ultimately form the foundation of their business?
Well, it's certainly, like you're talking about, it evolved over time. And I'm sure Irwin Jacobs from day one, when when they were thinking about we should apply CDMA to cellular, I'm sure they weren't thinking, yeah, we need a legal team, we need a standards team, we need,
Yeah.
so their approach and how it's different. I don't know if it's a whole lot different than the way a lot of other companies did at the time. Um, but they did, like there's names of a few people that come to mind, like Ed Tiedemann was one guy that talked to me quite a bit, who was involved in a lot of the standard stuff. They put their best people into the efforts in the standards,
Mm,
because initially, at least, it was about evangelization. It was
yeah.
about being able to talk about conceptual things that people had heard about these communication theories, to be able to present them and like, no, look, here's how it's practically done and implemented. Here's why it can be part of the standard. Um, so bringing your best technical talent into the standards process was certainly one of their hallmarks. Um, but the legal aspects and how it's intertwined. My comment about the ugliness, the standard setting process has always struck me as being something not just in the wireless industry but all industries is open to corruption. and
Yeah.
and it's kind of like the gloves come off, right? Everybody goes in with ulterior motives, and so it's not necessarily the best technical standard that they have in mind. Obviously, they're motivated to guide the standard towards their technologies where their strengths are. So I imagine it's kind of an ugly process, and it reminds me a lot of politics, the way it gets executed. Um, so I don't know if Qualcomm necessarily took a unique approach, but I think they took the same approach that they did in developing their technology. Throw our best minds and our best people on the problems,
Yeah.
see what kind of pushback we're getting, what are the problems, what are the hurdles that we're running into, and then pull the team back together and sit through all night sessions and all day long sessions and figure out how are we going to overcome this hurdle. So interestingly, there's a lot more secrecy around obviously legal and standard setting stuff. It's a lot more closed off than the technical discussions.
Mhm.
But I have to imagine that things got ugly in those early days, because the people I talked to just would shake their heads about the animosity between different companies,
Yeah.
arguing over standards. So I don't know if there's any secret sauce to that other than making the investment in it and being able to give your best people the time, to develop those standards and participate in them over the long haul, because those things develop over decades, not just you go to a conference one time, you pitch your paper, and you come back and you hope for the
Yeah.
best.
Yeah, some companies do that, but they tend not to have a very big piece of the pie. And
Yeah,
ultimately, I think standards exist to grow the overall pie for the market, but simultaneously, all the stakeholders are trying to get the biggest piece they can of that growing pie. So that's where those conflicts come in, where you get, um, in our market with wireless power, there's a difference between what the technology providers want for the standard, what the OEMs want for the standard, what the customers want from the standard, and so you just have different perspectives that come in. Theoretically, that type of competition of thought creates the best outcomes. But as you've alluded to, there could be disproportionate voice from
yep,
certain companies or portions of the standard setting bodies that, they're going to make sure that they get fed as big of a piece of a pie, even if it doesn't grow the overall pie for everyone. So it's a little, it's political, for sure. Having strong technology conviction, having good intellectual property, I have to imagine that was a big part of Qualcomm's
yep,
success. I think
yep,
that when it came to technical questions, even the Motorola's and the Ericssons were probably looking to the Qualcomm team to say, how does this work? What do you think? And when you have that technical edge and vision of where the market needs to go, even when you're smaller, when you're a mouse amongst those elephants, you could still navigate pretty well because they rely on your technical expertise. And those teams might have
yep.
one or two people that get it, but they don't have the clarity of focus and energy that your smaller company has to really understand holistically what's going on in a new technology.
Exactly. And if you think about the environment for setting standards, where all these are pretty much the key engineering minds in these companies coming together. that's your opportunity to see what does Motorola really know in this area? What are they really, and if you have a good team of engineers who are not only, technically knowledgeable, but understand, okay, here's the limitations in their approach, This is what they're trying to push into the standard. They can kind of read between the tea leaves, and it's in my experience is that's where you kind of get to see, okay, well, you show me your cards, I'll show you mine.
Yeah,
And there's a little bit of strategy there because you're not trying, you don't want to show everything, uh, but you want to understand where your competition is at, and that's also an avenue within those standard setting organizations to understand not only where your competing companies are going. They'll publicly say we're going after this market, and where their competence is. But this is where the engineers actually get to sit and face each other in the room and say, what do you guys, what do you really have? Do you really have
yeah,
pocket aces, or are you really bluffing, with
yeah.
this? So there's a whole list of dynamics that go in there, even outside the legal part that you mentioned as well. Um, and yeah, so it's interesting to think about Qualcomm as a engineering centric company. They were founded by engineers. Everything was about the technology and then finding a market to apply the technology. Whereas a lot of other companies are not that way. They're they're consumer product companies. They're looking at solving the problem, and then they're looking for the appropriate technology to solve that
Sure.
problem with. So in many ways, I think that it offered them advantages in terms of standard setting, because you're right, they're talking to different customers in there. They're trying to, you know, not only show that the technology has advantages, but here's the advantage for you, and then here's the advantage for you, and they may be different advantages, so they may need to, bring the whole package at that point.
That makes me think of other licensing companies that have done quite well. ARM comes to mind. Dolby comes to mind. They're also broad-based technologies that will apply to multiple end applications. And so you can see that OEM that has a focus area like consumer products, an Apple or a Motorola, they're probably not going to come up with that kind of technology or the real broad application and like powerful version of the technology because they're going to look at it narrowly through their lens. But if you look at the origin story of ARM, and there's a great book about ARM too called Mobile Unleashed. And it was about
Mhm.
12 people in a barn in Oxford and how they ended up creating what today is a $150 billion company. But they developed a new way of building microprocessors. And lo and behold, I've heard someone say that there's more microprocessors sold every year than McDonald's hamburgers using ARM
Yeah,
cores. So it's like the ultimate
exactly.
consumer product now. And but it just goes everywhere and it's broad. And I think you need these companies that focus on fundamental technology, intellectual property, and then the easy button to deploy it to make it possible for people to accept and adopt. You need those in order to empower these really big technical shifts.
Exactly, because it's really you're looking for those, that technical innovations in different areas to support your product, whether that's within your company, whether that's outside of your company in another organization like a Qualcomm, like an ARM. That's part of your roadmap if you are one of those consumer-focused companies. So
Yeah.
it's just interesting that Qualcomm's approach to that, they've never deviated. There's probably plenty of failures stories out there where companies tried to hop between both strategies.
Yeah.
Um, and sure, certainly Qualcomm was in that mode of, it's the kind of like a story when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail to you, right? I mean,
Totally.
it's
Yeah.
they knew their stuff cold. They knew communications cold, and they had evolved it over decades and been, involved in all the research and theoretical analysis. So and they never deviated from that focus. They were just looking for great applications for their technology where it could make a really big difference. They weren't just looking for the next product or the next generation. It's like, how can we fundamentally change the way communication works?
Yep. Make no small plans, as I say. So you wrote the definitive book, in my opinion, on Qualcomm's first 15, 20 years. They've been around now for about 35 years. Oh, so so let's break it into thirds. One is what you covered in detail in your book. You know that in and out.
Yeah.
Stage two is what's happened in the last 10, 15 years. And then stage three is what do you think is going to happen in the future with Qualcomm and with the impact on the industry in general.
Oh boy, yeah, and that was the hardest part of writing this book is where do I cut it off?
Sure.
And largely it's a two-part book, right? It's kind of the story. It's
Hmm.
answering that question that everybody was asking me, like, where do these guys come from? How did they
Hmm.
break in? How did they go from being a nobody to having all the answers and being in, the wireless kingpin is a term I had heard a lot. Um,
Hmm.
and then, yeah, and then where do we go from here? How do we evolve it and keep that innovation going? Um, so yeah, the in terms of addressing, I tried to get that original story of the breakthrough captured in the book, but then talk about the business model of how we then take this company to the next level. And certainly this period of the last few decades, I guess the book's almost 20 years old now,
Wow.
has been really interesting. I don't follow Qualcomm in detail anymore, but I think the battles with Broadcom and some of the litigation battles with Apple and stuff like that have been really interesting and telling, because it's just the stakes kind of keep going up, right? They keep battling for dominance of certain markets.
Yeah.
Um, and I just can't help but get this image. I mean, Qualcomm's obviously evolves as a company, and with Jacobs no longer at the helm and thing, it's a different company. But fundamentally, I just have this picture that they're, they just don't want to bother with the legal tussle. They just want to build great product. We just want to build great technologies, and I think they keep that core going, and that's the legacy that lives on. So even with all the public battles with Broadcom and various other players, litigation over royalty rights and things like that, as long as they keep that technical core there and the spirit of innovation of really beating problems up and getting those theoretical technologies that we know on paper are going to advance this industry, getting them into practical implementation, is what's going to have them be around the next 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years. And I think they'll do it. I think the biggest question at the time, I was getting from I guess from a business standpoint or an investing standpoint, is a lot of questions around. I think it was like probably early 2000. Would they ever separate the chipset business from the licensing business? And I'd always argued the advantages of keeping them together, just kind of knowing, because I'm an engineer myself, and I know, you know, the back and forth between those two, strategic efforts within a company. Investors are mainly arguing they just wanted to see better returns. They wanted to see a
Sure.
more profitable business on one side. They wanted to be able to invest differently. But there's so much synergy between, owning a core competence in how you realize these technologies in chipsets. And I think that's what's made ARM so successful in a lot of these other models, along with the intellectual property and having the knowledge mindset there, and then the legal team to be able to defend it. I think keeping those together, if they had broken those apart, I think we would see a very different Qualcomm today and a very different future.
Yeah, there's a reason why Apple went to the FTC asking them for help in basically breaking apart Qualcomm.
Yep.
And that's not every day where you get the world's number one or two most valuable company asking the government for help because one of their suppliers has such a strong business that they can't assert their leverage. So I
Yep.
think keeping the chips together with the licensing, I think the way that Qualcomm does technology transfer licensing, not just patent licensing, is very
Yep.
critical. And you said just staying a couple years ahead. So any number of companies has tried to do what Qualcomm does. Intel famously failing at that. Apple, I don't want to say failing, but not being able to keep up with the aggressive pace of chip development that Qualcomm has.
Yeah.
If they could stay ahead and they could keep their IP intact, and if they keep that core of wanting to build great technology, I agree that it's a good, strong case for a bright future for them as well.
Exactly. Yeah, and it'll be really interesting, to see what's in their future, because inevitably, as a larger company, you have to diversify, and into a lot of the acquisitions they've had, and obviously building the software stacks on top of the chipsets and software.
Yeah.
There's a lot of arguments to say that all these ancillary areas and markets they're getting into, Brew and the different types of chipset variations with Snapdragon and stuff. it's by themselves, they're no one looks at them as any great success, but looking at the whole ecosystem, you need all those parts a lot of times in order to keep your edge and to keep moving because the problems and the ideas to solve them are coming from all different directions. You mentioned AI early in the conversation. There's probably going to be some really new problems that come about with, societies and
Yeah.
that are going to need solving, and we can't see them right now, but it's not going to be just one technology and one piece and one core competence. It's probably going to come from several directions. So
Yeah, absolutely agree. Breakthroughs in technology kind of disrupt the status quo, but they create so much, historically, they create so much abundance of opportunity and growth. So I feel optimistic not only about that AI conversation, but also about where Qualcomm's going. And I'm appreciative of what they've done and what they've enabled. But even more so in this moment, I'm appreciative of you for putting this story down on paper, doing the research, sharing it with everybody, and then being willing to come on proof points and talk about it with me and with our audience. So thank you so much for your time today, and I really appreciate your insights.
oh, thank you, Jacob. It was great to discuss Qualcomm.